Hello, class. So this is the second session in Oedipus the King. So in the first session, right, we discussed the background, right, some of the changes that are occurring from from our first text, which was Odysseus, um, the Odyssey of Homer, right, written by Homer, until now we have Sophocles and our main protagonist, um, Oedipus. Right. So there are certain key differences to keep in mind, okay? In addition to certain key continuities, right? Things which do not change, which are also just as significant for our text. So we mentioned some uh, key differences, okay? One of the key differences is that we are given the impression, right, that in the world of Sophocles, uh, the cosmos that that Oedipus inhabits is not chaotic, and it is not arbitrary, but what we have is an ordered cosmos, right? A predictable cosmos, and a cosmos that is, to an extent, that has the element of beauty in it, right? That there is beauty to this order and so forth. And this is going to be quite significant for us because when you have an ordered cosmos, this begs the question of truth, right? We can now speak more coherently about what is true versus what is false, right? Now, why? Because when you have order, then you can begin to conceive of things as having a particular permanent place in the cosmos, and this includes the place of man, right? If you had had no permanent place in the cosmos, then you would not have been able to really ask or grasp the question or give significance to the question, what is man, i.e., what is my place in the cosmos? Now, it remains it remains to be said in Oedipus the King that the place of man, much like Gilgamesh, is shrouded in mystery. So yes, the cosmos is ordered. Yes, there is the question of truth, but the truth is not made transparent to man, and we find this very clear in the type of actually throughout the play, but in particular the type of debate or antagonism that is taking place between Tiresias, who, if you want to say, represents the cosmic order, he's like a prophet, and between Oedipus, who is trying to understand one of the most basic truths, right, which we would think is the right of Oedipus to know, which is the truth with regards to one, the murderer, but in reality, what is his place in the cosmos, right? What is the reality of his origins? So one of the things to keep in mind, one of the significant points to keep in mind is that we find throughout the text that the cosmos, so to speak, or Tiresias, is trying to prevent Oedipus from discovering the truth. Why? Of course, we will see later. But one of the important things to bear in mind is that there is somewhat of an antagonism between man's pursuit of the truth and between the religious institutions of the time. Now, what does this play represent? We had said earlier that Sophocles was raised in a radical time, right? This was in the last half of the 5th century, where the philosophers and the sophists and we're putting into question this idea of prophecy, right? This idea that man should essentially surrender to his fate, right? That man should not take up the question of truth and knowledge, right? So we find a kind of rebellion, so to speak. And this coincides with the intellectual revolution. We had the Protagoras, we had the sophist Protagoras, who was a key intellectual figure at the time, saying things such as the individual is the measure of all things, right? Of the existence of what exists and the non-existence of what does not exist, right? So we have the shift from a cosmos that is centered around man, around the gods, to a cosmos that is centered around fate, and then giving way to this idea of man as being the maximum of all things. And precisely because now man is empowered with the capacity to ask questions of truth, which are in reality, right, philosophical questions. So in some way, we find the inauguration of what we call philosophy, right? This is paving the way for philosophy. So let's say a few things about the culture this radical age. The first is that religious institutions and fatalism, which were an integral part of Greek culture, were being questioned, okay, were being criticized. Two, that historians regard this century to be one of intellectual revolution, where a lot of these religious institutions were put under scrutiny, right? Three, that we have a new vision of the cosmos, and this is key. In Homer's world, the cosmos had no order, right? The gods were chaotic and arbitrary. In Sophocles' world, fate replaces the gods and provides order. Okay. The notion of order introduces a new set of possibilities, right? Now there is the idea of truth, and because the truth exists external to me and is part of an order, then it is something that I could possibly discover. And this, of course, brings about the intellectual revolution. You also have, as a result of this change in attitude, the new maxim, which, as we said, is that man is the measure of all things, right? And then we have the Oedipus. Now, this brings us to our text, that Oedipus is really the representative, right? The Athenian man who comes to represent this new era, right? Now, something to be said about Oedipus is that the text portrays him not only as a man who is pursuing knowledge, right, a philosopher, but that he is very much a man of action. Now, why is this important, right? When we talk about a man of action, and why does the text emphasize that he is a man of action as opposed to just a man of philosophy, right? So the text could have easily introduced to us Oedipus as a philosopher, but instead it emphasizes him constantly being engaged in certain adventures and the act of defying the oracle and his wife and so forth, because the idea of action, right, stands in opposition to the idea of fate. So the pursuit of truth for Sophocles was not just a matter of philosophical speculation, but it is also the active defiance of one's given fate, right? And this is, again, very significant to the last half of this 5th century. Now, in order to really appreciate this epic, right, this period of time, it is useful that we introduce the idea of a tragedy, because this text is ultimately a mode of tragedy. And what is a tragedy? It is essentially a way to tell a story. It is a common form, a way in which we can structure a series of events, okay? Now, the way that we tell a story, right, For example, is it a story of redemption? Is it a comedy, and so forth? The way that we tell a story largely mirrors our worldview. So the fact that this text is a story tells us, as a tragedy, tells us something about the worldview of Sophocles. Now, why is it that a text such as this, wherein you have a hero who is a man of action and he is pursuing the truth, why would he's pursuing what is considered to be true? Why would this be a tragedy, right? Generally, when we think about the pursuit of truth, when we think about action, right, we think of redemption. We think of something that is positive, right? We think of stories of redemption, and this is popular, right, in modern literature. Whereas at the end, when one discovers the truth, one discovers something that is good, something that is positively enlightening, right? Something which contributes to the continuity of man and his happiness, for example. So then, why would the Greeks regard this pursuit of truth as being, on one hand, necessary, and on the other hand, to be a form of tragedy? So this is something I actually want you to think about as you are reading the text, and it will be the topic of your reflection paper, okay? To try kind of bring these two apparent juxtapositions together, and to try to understand why this text is written in the form of a tragedy. The hint is, of course, it reflects a particular worldview. So briefly, kind of to situate your inquiry or your investigation, what are the elements of a tragedy? Essentially, you have a plot, right, where the play takes place, right, and the order of events. Now, this is important because when we talk about the plot, right, and the place wherein all of these events take place, keep in mind here that we are not just talking about the kingdom of Oedipus, but we are also talking about the cosmos, right? Second is the theme, right? What does the play mean? Not just what happens, not just the series of events, as in the case of the plot, but the theme, it refers to the meaning, right? Third, the character, right? What does the character represent in each play, in the play? The language that is used by the various actors, right? 5, the visual statement, which is the spectacle, right? The scenic effect, kind of like the scenery that is taking place. And of course, then you have the music and the rhythm, which is the 5th element. So, I mean, the spectacle and the visual statements would require somewhat of a deeper analysis, which is beyond the scope of a reflection. But what I would focus on is the plot, i.e., that this is taking place within a kingdom and the city, right? And the cosmos, the theme, right? And the characters, right? The characters that are involved in this text. Now, what is the storyline and the structure of a tragedy? Okay. First, we have there's essentially 5 elements. Okay. First, we have a tragic hero who has a noble stature. Now, had he not had a noble stature, right, we would not have been able to empathize with him. Therefore, his tragic end would not have been something which we deem to be tragic, right? He is noble by virtue of us being able to relate to him in one way or another. The second, the tragic hero is represented as good but not perfect, again, allowing us to uh, be able to relate to him. And this is what gives the story its spice, so to speak, right? That the tragic hero is represented as good but not perfect, right? And uh, thus continuously experiences some kind of fall, right? Some kind of error, and so forth. Third, that the fall that um, the hero experiences is inevitable, right? This is what they call the tragic flaw, meaning that it is not just a mistake that is made in the passing, but that this mistake has to do with something that is inherent to the hero. So, for example, our human condition, right? Our limitations, the fact that we are forgetful, the fact that we have an element of arrogance. These are all things that they are tragic flaws, right? Which are inherent to our condition. And again, this is what allows us to relate to the hero rather than to see this fall as being something that is inherently evil. So if the fall, right, the tragic error were, for example, that were like Gilgamesh, right, that Oedipus was a tyrant, we would not have really been able to relate to the hero in this case. But in the case of Oedipus, we find, you will see that the flaw is something that really is in a way unavoidable, right? It is something that is part and parcel of our human condition. Now, four, given that the tragic hero who falls is good, the audience will sympathize with the hero. That's obvious enough. Now, five, the tragic fall does not come to represent an annihilation or an absolute loss of the hero. Rather, it is accepted to some degree and considered to be part of our maturity. So let's say the tragic fall in terms of the ending, okay? The tragedy that occurs in the ending. Now, this is what is quite, might seem contradictory to Greek literature and confusing, right? Whereas it is not a contradiction. Can we find good in tragedy? Well, for the Greeks, yes, right? We will find that for the Greeks, the tragedy that befalls, the tragic fall that inflicts Oedipus in the end is considered indeed tragic, but at the same time necessary for our own maturity. And sometimes, in our day-to-day lives, right, we will, at first, if a tragedy were to befall us, we would at first see it as something that is an evil, something that should have been avoided. But then over time, we might come to realize that as a result of this tragedy, we matured in one way or another, right? That it was somewhat of a necessary evil. And for Oedipus, you will find that without giving away the plot, that it was necessary precisely because it allowed him to mature. It was necessary because it unveiled something. Now, why is this maturity important? This sense of maturing and this unveiling necessary? Well, that's part of the plot, and that is precisely what I want you to reflect on, right? It would just do well to remember, again, the difference that I highlighted in the beginning between Homer and between the world of Sophocles. Okay, so let's take the rest of this session to kind of go deeper into the question of truth as it plays out in 5th century Greek philosophy, and kind of look at the implications. Now, in our first few sessions, we repeated this idea of our human condition as essentially consisting of two things. The first is the question of where from, which is really man or woman's desire to ask questions about their origins. And the second is where to, which is our desire to pursue a project, to project ourselves onto the future and to essentially make a life for ourselves, right? A meaningful life for ourselves and so forth. Now, let's kind of zoom into that first question, the question of where from, right? So in this text, we begin to find some direct recognition of this question, right? A direct engagement with this question. Now, what is revealed to us in the text, right, upon closer reading, is that the pursuit of truth consists of really two things. First of all, there is the idea that there is a truth. There is the recognition that there is a truth that is external to me, that it is something that I can grab. It is something that I can discover. And the second is the idea that, so essentially that when I say that I can discover it, meaning that the truth is not something that I create. The truth is not something that that is subjective, but that the truth is something that is to be discovered. Okay. Now the second thing, given that the truth is external to me, there's the idea that, okay, now I ought to pursue the truth. So given that the truth is external to me, right? Now there's a question of the pursuit of the truth. Now the pursuit of the truth, right, requires several things, right? First of all, that I have the rational capacity to do so. And two, that I have the free will and the choice to do so. Now, without the tools and without the free will needed, I would not be able to pursue the truth. And this would seem to be somewhat of a very tragic hint, very tragic paradox, right? That the truth is there, external to me, waiting to be discovered, but that I do not have the capacity or that I do not have the free will needed to pursue that truth. Now, how this plays out in Oedipus the King, again, this is something I want you guys to think about and look into. Of course, there is not one right answer, right? Now, this desire to pursue the truth, like we said, is part of our human condition. And it plays out in Gilgamesh, Odysseus, and Oedipus, of course, in different ways, right? One could argue, although this is not necessarily the case, that, for example, the truth means something different for Gilgamesh, right? Right. Remember when you compared him to Nietzsche, it was somewhat far. The concept of truth is far more ambivalent in the case of Odysseus. For Oedipus, given that he lives in an ordered universe where there is fate and fate is absolute, then and everything has its place, then the concept of truth takes up a new meaning, and therefore there are new stakes. Okay, so when we talk about the idea of truth, right? When we say that we want to discover the truth, now how does that relate to the question of the truth of who am I? Okay, so for for this idea of the truth might seem ambiguous, right? Because when we talk about worldly objects, right, and I say, for example, this cup is a cup, right? That is the truth of it, right? On a surface level, of course, without going into the um, other philosophical debates. But if I were to say this cup is a cup, that's pretty much all there is to it, right? But when I say, for example, that Oedipus is a king, right? What exactly isn't that a truth that Oedipus is a king? So then, what exactly is Oedipus trying to pursue, right? The For the Greeks, for Oedipus, he did not just want to know. The truth meant that the pursuit of what is hidden to be discovered did not merely mean that I want to that the question of what Oedipus is in terms of his social and political life, right? In terms of our social and political lives, we know what we are, right? I am Lebanese. I am an instructor. I am, I don't know, Muslim, Christian, so forth, right? Um, these are our social, political roles, right? Identities. For Odysseus, and this is what we will pursue in more detail when we talk about Plato, the the truth of the who am I, the where from, was not about Oedipus's place in the city, nor was it his place in his his family relations. It was what is my place in the cosmos? What is my place in the ultimate order of things? So we find here a very significant distinction for the Greeks that will play out throughout our course. And this distinction is important to be able to appreciate what exactly it was that philosophers are trying to do. It's that when I think of my identity, I am not just thinking of my identity at the level of history, right? I am thinking of my identity at the level of the cosmos in terms of ultimate origins. And this is what we had mentioned earlier when we said that when you find yourself uh, in that white room, the analogy that we used earlier, the empty room, you would not end your curiosity would not be satisfied by merely saying, "Oh, I am in a white room." You would want to say, "Who put me in this white room? Why am I in this white room? Is there something beyond this white room? Right? Is there a purpose to this room?" So it's the same thing with Oedipus. Oedipus is not satisfied with the answer, "You are a king" or "You are a great husband." He wants to understand, right? For him, the truth means what is my ultimate place in the cosmos, right? What is my permanent place? And this is precisely, and this is all really embodied um, uh, in the discussion between Oedipus, which I have opened here. This is why I'm open to this page. Um, uh, that his discussion with the oracle, where Tiresias tells him when Oedipus is persisting, he tells him, "Just send me home. You bear your burdens, I'll bear mine. It's better that way. Please believe me." So now, of course, when you read the text, you will find that the play is not that simple, right? It's not simply a matter of, oh, well, I do not want to unveil the truth to you just out of spite, right? We find that there is actually a mystery that the novel begins with. Um, and I'll leave you to read about that mystery, the murder mystery, yourself. But one thing that I would encourage you to do is to read this symbolically, right? Read this symbolically, right? And try to understand how does this whole murder mystery play into the concept, the more cosmic idea of tragedy. So in the next week, what we will do is we will use this. I mean, I hopefully you'd have read the text, and then we will kind of summarize some of our findings, and then segue into Plato and look at how we have this transformation from from Odysseus to Oedipus to Plato, and how we have this clean, not very clean, but we have a somewhat more clear um, transformation of Greek philosophy that leads us up to Plato, where we can begin to more uh, definitively pursue some of the questions of the scores that up until now had been narrated to us in somewhat of a story form. Now we are able to engage with them on more solid and definitive terms and philosophical terms. See you guys next week. Goodbye.